So I think we're all pretty familiar with many of the top tips and best practices when it comes to creating compelling landscape composition. So things like the use of foreground elements and leading lines and layers to create depth, all of which are absolutely fantastic pieces of advice. But being able to effectively apply these techniques while you're actually on location in a real world scenario, that is a completely different story. And I know I've shared this with you before, but when I first got started with landscape photography, I quickly came to the conclusion that improving my own compositional skill set, that would be the way that I can improve my overall photography the most in the shortest amount of time. So I became absolutely obsessed with all things related to composition. I consumed as much information on the topic that I possibly could to where when I would get on location, I would completely freeze. I couldn't even get out of my own way. I filled my brain with so much information regarding composition that I never really spent much time implementing it in a real world scenario, practicing applying these techniques in whenever I would get on location. I never practiced, never put a lot of time into that. And where I'm going with all this, the reason I bring this up is because simply knowing is just half the battle. But being able to accurately and effectively apply these techniques when you're in a real world scenario, when you're on location, that's what matters most. And in this video, I want to share with you 5 steps that has drastically improved or helped me, I guess, identify more intriguing and eye-pleasing compositions when I get on location. And instead of me just sitting here rattling off 5 tips for you to try, I want to walk you through this kind of evolution I should say compositional evolution from a recent trip of mine to the Blue Ridge Mountains to photograph the fall color. I think this set of images is a fantastic graphic, I guess, representation or illustration of these 5 steps in practice. So to jump right into it, the very first step is something that I simply call the reason. And the reason is the most common sense, the most obvious, and the easiest step of everything. And the reason is basically, why are you going to this location? Is the reason because you want to photograph this cliff? Is it this canyon? Is it the ocean, the sea? Is it a woodland area, a mountain, or a river, stream, or a waterfall, which is the case in this scenario right here? But the reason is very important to identify in the very beginning because that's what your composition is going to be built around. Your composition is basically, the sole purpose is really to drive traffic, which is people's eyeballs, to drive traffic to your reason in your overall scene. So for this particular image, this is the very first image that I took when I got to this scene. And of course, the reason is this waterfall. This is a massive cascading waterfall, and this is actually the upper portion of this waterfall. So that's the reason I traveled to this destination, was to photograph this scene. And this was the very first image that I took. I don't know about you, but whenever I get on location, the very first couple of images I take are nowhere even close to the final composition that I settled on. And I think in this particular scenario, I took maybe 40 or 50 different versions of this composition. Many of them are drastically different than what this is, but it took that many images and that many different tweaks and subtle changes to this composition before I could actually identify the final composition that I went with. But this is where it all started right here. Now, once you have the reason identified, which usually only takes a couple of seconds, but once you have that established, the second step is to ask yourself, what are the elements? What are the supporting elements? And the purpose of the supporting elements a lot of times is just to drive traffic to your reason. So basically, the elements are going to direct the viewer's eyes, direct the viewer's attention to the reason of your scene. So in this situation, it was the waterfall. And the reason this was the very first photograph that I took was because I saw this log right here. This right here kind of pointing up to the waterfall. I was like, okay, that's kind of like a very obvious leading line scenario right there. It's a very obvious foreground element. So let me just start there. So I started to make some subtle tweaks. This is probably the 3rd or 4th image I took. And as you can see, I shifted the log over here. That way it's more in the foreground. It's a little bit more obvious, directing the viewer's eye up to the actual waterfall right here. But it just didn't fit the scene very well. It felt a little bit odd. It was almost a little bit too dominant. So I started to shift my focus around a little bit. And probably one of the biggest, I'd say, supporting elements in this scene is the fall color in the background. That's kind of the backdrop to this overall photograph. So all of the fall color up through here is definitely a supporting element. All of the fall leaves on all the rocks down here and through here and all through here. These are all supporting elements that I want to make sure are in my composition. So that was a big part to me is how do I position this composition to where I can get as much of this fall color in the image as I possibly can. And then here's another version of that composition where I actually identified this tree right here. And the reason I kind of shifted my composition over to the left, let me go back one image, is because this overall photograph, let me delete this adjustment brush, is because the photograph felt very imbalanced. There was a lot of visual weight over here, but there wasn't a whole lot up through this area right through here. So it kind of felt like the whole image was just kind of leaning towards one side, and it just felt a little bit imbalanced. So I swung my camera over just a little bit to the left, and I identified this tree right here, which is a very dominant tree. It's very eye-catching. It's a very pleasing tree. So it can't really get, I should say, lost in the shuffle with the other trees. It's kind of in the mid-ground area, and it's got a very unique look to it. And I felt that this right here really helped to kind of balance out all of the weight on this side of the scene right through here. So I definitely wanted to use that as a supporting element as well. So I had all the fall color in the background, the fall leaves on the rocks, this dominant tree on the left side of the frame, and wanted to look for at least one more. And I backed up a little bit, and I picked up this kind of cave area right through here. This is the side of the cave. So I was kind of nestled to the left of this area. So I kind of took a few steps back to include a little bit more of the fall color up through here. And I also wanted to be able to include as much of the leaves down here in the foreground because that's going to draw the viewer's eye into the scene. But I also wanted to try and utilize this right here because it kind of made this kind of like cozy feeling, like you're kind of tucked into this little area, almost like you're looking out of a cave into this scene. So I kind of like that as well. So those were really the supporting elements in the scene. And a lot of times that step, the second step, is what takes the most amount of time, at least for me. Now, the third step is basically identifying the distractions. And this is super critical as well. You might have heard things called like edge patrol, where you walk your eyes around the edge of your scene, just looking for things that could compete for the viewer's attention. And in this scene right here, when I started to look at it, I was like, you know what? Maybe this giant cliff or rock right here, maybe it's a little bit too dominant in the frame. Maybe that's serving as a distraction. So I zoomed in just a little bit more and picked up this, just the edge of it right there. But then I started to think about it. I was like, well, maybe that's a distraction as well, just because it's just a little bit of stone surface sticking out from the upper left-hand corner. So I took a few steps forward, zoomed in a little bit, and now I removed that cliff face, but I picked up this area of the tree, and this is that nice tree. This is just kind of the edge. So this whole area up here now looks very, very distracting to me. So that wasn't going to work. Then I flipped it into a vertical orientation, and I highly recommend that whenever you're composition scouting, when you're on location, to flip your orientation. So no matter what orientation you're in, just flip it to the opposite, just to see what the scene feels like. See if you can pick up a different composition, because it totally changes the perspective. And when I first did this, I really liked it. I liked the balance that this tree had here. It just fit perfect in this upper left-hand corner. I like the space right through here. But what I was doing is I was losing a lot of the fall color. This is all I had right here in the foreground. There wasn't a ton of fall color up through this region right here. So I felt like I was losing that as a supporting element. I also lost that beautiful dominant tree as well. So I wasn't happy with that either. And then I kind of shifted over a little bit more. And once again, this whole area seemed like a distraction. So that wasn't going to work either. So just taking a few extra minutes and just identifying what those distractions are really going to help you refine your overall composition. Now, the fourth step is something that I just call the light. Now, a lot of times, maybe there isn't light, but looking for dappled light, any kind of contrasting light, because that's going to be very interesting in your photograph. And if you do see areas of dappled light or interesting light or contrasting light, you want to try and figure out a way to work that into your composition. Now, I wouldn't recommend completely altering your composition to chase a little bit of light off to the left or the right of your scene. But if there's a way to effectively implement it into your composition, I definitely would. And if you look at this scene here, you might say, Mark, there's no light in this scene. And you're 100% right. There's very little light. But what this has is a very distinct region of contrasting light. And I've mentioned this in a video before, that a lot of times in post-processing, I like to darken down my foreground with a gradient filter just a little bit and have it subtly fade to a brighter color or brighter light in the midground and into the background, because that darker foreground area and brighter background area creates that kind of natural eye or natural path for the human eye to travel, and it also creates a lot of depth. And this scene has that naturally. This whole area right through here is very dark or darker, and in this area is much brighter up through here. So it just has that natural kind of pull of light, this contrast, darker area here and then brighter here. So the eye would travel across the overall photograph, which is always the goal. So I think that was very important with this scene, is that contrasting light. That's something that I really like about this photograph. Now, the fifth and final step might be one of the most important steps of the process, and a lot of times it's the most difficult to see as well, and it's called just shapes. And I think that shapes, a lot of times your eye will identify a shape in a scene before it even identifies anything else. And there's shapes all throughout nature, but especially triangles. Triangles are very powerful to try and implement into your photography. Triangles create symmetry, they create balance. And in this image right here, there is a ton of triangles all throughout this photograph, which I absolutely love. You know, in the foreground, you have this triangle here, you have this triangle here, you have one up here as well. So I wanted to figure out exactly how do I incorporate, or how do I make these even more dominant in my frame? So when I shifted over a little bit, the problem with this was I lost this channel right through here. So when I swung my camera to the right, I no longer have that channel there. And that makes these triangles not as dominant in the frame anymore. And I started to like this a little bit more as well, because this was another triangle. And this is kind of the time when I'm starting to really lock in on what my composition is. I think this is towards the end of my shoot, and I'm getting very close to what my final composition for this actual image is. So I shifted back over a little bit to pick up this stream right through here, which was exactly what was needed to create this triangle. And then you had this triangle here, this one here, you had this kind of the side of this cave right here, which is also a triangle. And even the waterfall creates a triangle all pointing in to this center area right here. And these are all raw photographs. None of these are edited or anything like that. But it all points to this center area right here. And this was the final version that I ended up going with. Actually, I shot this version quite a few times because I noticed every once in a while you'd get this little spillover right here of this water, which I really wanted that. But this was the final version that I went with. And here is the almost edited or almost fully edited version of this photograph, which I really like the way that it did come out. There's probably a few other tweaks that I'll make to this image, but this is for the most part the final version of it. But all the triangles right here that just draw the viewer's eye to the center part of the photograph right through here. And I just think that this image has a lot of visual flow to it, between the contrasting light and the triangles all pointing to the center of the photograph. It just absolutely it works for me. And I felt that this was just a perfect graphic illustration or representation of these 5 steps. So if I do hope that that was helpful. I know that was a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. I try and keep these videos under 20 minutes or even 15 minutes most of the time, but I try and pack them full of as much information as I possibly can. So if you do have any questions about anything that was mentioned in the video, please leave those in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy it, if you could give it a thumbs up, definitely helps the video perform better, helps the channel perform better. And ring the little bell notification as well, just that way you are notified the next time I do upload. And subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really, really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.